Brant DXT grain carts have efficient unload speeds, large carrying capacities, unmatched durability, and reliable components that make sure your cart is working when you are. Lead the field with DXT grain carts from Brant. Visit your local Brant dealer for more information.
All right, joining me now is Brian Voth. He is president of IntelliFarm. That's IntelliFarm.ca. He's also a Manitoban and incredibly tall. Welcome here, Brian.
Thanks, Lindsay. How are you today?
Melting. Thank you for asking. Ontario is in an absolute, it's a heater of a summer. Let's just put it that way. It has been melty. It has been humid. It's a good old-fashioned Ontario summer, as I've been told, which means I'm miserable. How has Manitoba been?
Quite comfortable, actually. I mean, it's been dry, which is, as you would know, a little bit odd here.
Yeah.
We haven't even really had the, 6 weeks of sweltering humidity that we would normally have. Super smoky here again this week, so that's always pleasant. But my wife actually flew into Toronto yesterday, and she said too, she got out of the airport, she's like, holy Hannah, it is hot out here.
So the air is wet, Brian.
Yeah.
Like you go outside and it's like, ugh. Anyway.
Well,
yeah.
funny thing, like when we moved to Ontario and people said, oh, it's like so humid here or whatever. The first summer we were there was a dry summer. And I'm
Right.
like, what's everybody complaining about? It's no different than Manitoba.
That's when I moved to Saskatchewan years ago, lived there for just over 3 years. And the first summer I was there, it was wet, like it rained. And I was used to Manitoba, so I was complaining. And everyone looked at me like I had horns because in Saskatchewan, you never complain about the rain.
Yeah.
Like never. Because sometimes the tap turns off and it never turns back on.
Yeah.
Well, never is a long time, but it could be years. Which, of course, brings us to part of our discussion. I was hoping for something super exciting to tackle today, but you work in the markets. How would you describe commodity markets these days?
What's the rating on this show? What kind of words can I use?
You have to use very family-friendly words.
Because that might play into my decision here.
Okay. It's family-friendly. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Really, really dull. And it's been a bit of an abnormal, last 4 or 5 months because seasonally we would get a rally, into the first part of the year, January, February, then back off and then get another rally, usually into spring, summer, based on, seeding conditions, acreage reports, things like that, and then potential weather scares into summer. And then usually by July, end of June, something like that, we back off again until harvest. Well, we haven't done anything. We had the February rally, and aside from canola, which is maybe the one exciting topic to talk about, I guess, aside from canola, everything else has literally just slid lower since February. A few rallies here and there, but really not much has happened at all. And so that's why it's been so dull, because there just hasn't really been any good marketing opportunities since February. Canola aside.
Canola aside. Okay. So, and we will talk about canola in a moment, but now there's sometimes boring can be good, because sometimes boring means, hey, volatility means I'm not going to lose money, etc. But sometimes boring also means we're stuck with not great prices. So where are we at relative to where maybe some producers would like to be?
Well, from where producers would like to be, we're a long ways away, because the answer is always more.
More
and
higher.
Which is really not a good answer because it's rather subjective too. But no, to me, I actually think we are bouncing off of the bottom right now. We're actually back to basically the same levels as last August when we bottomed out and then started to move up. And if you go back, it's funny you mentioned that dull can be okay because the alternative can be a little bit wild. And if you go, 2021 or 2020, 21, 22 was the polar opposite. And
yeah.
And I remember telling some people, I'm ready for some precedented times again after that whole stretch.
Yes.
Well, I mean, now it's like this is really dull and we could have a little bit of excitement, but maybe not quite to that extreme again. So, but even back in 2022, 23, I remember having conversations with Sean and him asking where I thought things were going. these levels that we have right now, this is where I said we were going from 2 years ago already. And so when you look at the long-term cycles of markets, this isn't actually unusual that after a big price spike and a drop, you go sideways, and it could be for 3, 4, 5 years in a row.
Right.
And that is, so far at least, since we bottomed out last fall, that is exactly what we've done. And so in that sense, not really unexpected, but it doesn't make it any more interesting or exciting. It's just we're now going sideways in a new range from where we were sideways between 2014 to 2020.
Right. Now, what I find interesting about at least some of this is that at least commodity markets wise, kind of dull. But like when we look at all the political wrangling, trade deals, trade agreements, back of the napkin stuff, all the volatility between Canada and the US, etc., and yet we have this dullness in the commodity markets. Do you have thoughts on that? Why do you think that is?
I would say the biggest thing comes down to that there's ample supply of grains around the world right now. And so there isn't this underlying concern like there was in 2020, 21 when the supply side got squeezed. Now it comes down more to demand. And that's what you're seeing, especially with the political stuff. You're seeing these demand trends shift. So, the historical patterns of typically China would be buying a lot of US soybeans for October, November delivery. So like harvest delivery out of the US. Well, that has been almost non-existent, but they have really ramped up purchases from Brazil. So these trade flows are being altered at this point anyways. And yeah, I think the bulk of that is because of this whole uncertainty. And I mean, it all kind of centers around one country or one person in a country, I should say, I guess. And just the uncertainty as to what's going to happen going forward. And unfortunately, everybody else gets dragged into this dilemma then.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let us then talk about the one perhaps more interesting part of the commodity complex, canola. Where are we at as far as pricing, and where are we at as far as you said, the supply and demand shifts? Why is canola perhaps more interesting than some of the other commodities?
So canola is the one that is not in the excess supply situation. And interestingly enough, like Stats Canada finally did update production numbers and whatnot from the last 3 years to account for the fact that based on the numbers that they were using, we would have this massive negative carryout, which is obviously mathematically impossible. And so production clearly had been understated for the last few years. And so they have to start going back and making these adjustments so that the math actually works. But demand has been phenomenal. We ship the bulk of our canola oil south to the US. That does tie us into this whole trade issue because of all of the uncertainty around the biofuel policies and what was going to happen with canola oil coming from Canada. It does look like that's going to pass and it'll be fine and we'll be able to keep shipping stuff there. Then you drag in China and their tariffs. And this one is a really interesting one. When this all happened back in February, March, it seemed like everybody read this, they're putting tariffs on canola oil and canola meal. But everybody kind of read this as we're putting tariffs on canola.
Right. Not the same thing.
Raw canola seed was not included in this. And so then when you break it down, like China's a big buyer of canola meal, but they buy almost no oil. And so, it's like, well, they're not going to tariff the raw seed. Plus, when you look at their crush capacity that they have in China, it makes more sense for them to buy raw seed, ship it there, because A, it's easy, and B, they have the crush capacity. So, there was a lot of people that panicked, obviously, when canola dropped, and canola did drop on this news because it's a headline thing. Yeah. And, we kind of sat back and said, well, this doesn't make any sense when you look at the fundamental side and you look at the actual announcement, not just the assumption of, they're going to put tariffs on canola. Maybe they will at some point, but as of then and now, that's not the case. And so I think there was a lot of canola that got dumped, at the $13, $14 level in Feb, March, early April. And then we proceeded to rally to, $17 again. But it does highlight just how tight the canola market is. And that is not going to change. With our increased crush capacity here, exports are going to have to get rationed this coming year again. And anyone that has a crush plant is also an exporter. So they're going to prioritize crushing over exports because their crush plants can only do one thing.
That's right.
And so the exports are going to have to get rationed to an extent. So even if China were to say we're going to put a tariff onto canola, well, there wouldn't have been as much for them to buy anyways. Plus, I always go back to the situation that if China says they're putting tariffs onto something, they had no intention of buying it anyways. So
That's
it
right.
was going to happen regardless.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating to see, exactly that. You read a headline and you think, oh, this is like super bad. And don't get me wrong, yes, a tariff on all canola would be awful. But when you read the details, that's just it. When we talk about global markets and we talk about trade, like each component of canola, so there is seed, there is oil, there is meal, they are each their own thing that is traded. And so
Right.
the details really do matter here. And exactly that. I think it is incredibly important to recognize sort of the posturing and the political side of what gets tariffed and what doesn't. And especially with China, like we've seen that with the US as well. China likes to make these announcements based on stuff they didn't need it anymore. And then it becomes, a bargaining chip that really isn't something to be bargained, right? So I don't know who's learning from who on this
Well,
one, but there we
I've
go.
I've always said too, like China is very good at getting what they want on
Mm-hmm.
their own terms because
Yeah.
they do have so much pull on the markets because of their demand side.
Yeah.
As a Mennonite, I've also joked that I think China is probably the best Mennonites out there because we could all learn a lesson from them on how to get a deal. But that aside,
But do they have coupons, Brian? They need coupons.
well,
Okay.
maybe we could introduce that to them. I don't
We
know.
should. Okay. Yeah. Anyone
Canola
not
coupons.
not anyone not from Southern Manitoba will not get that joke. But it's really important to have a coupon. Anyway,
Yeah,
it
exactly.
is true. They will. I mean, they're master manipulators at getting a really good deal. And I
Yep.
mean, and realistically, the economy the size that it is, that they can do that, right? It is now, I guess that brings us to, though, that second part of that discussion is looking ahead. And I'm not saying China is not about to be important because it always will be, or at least for the foreseeable future. But the discussion is that maybe it's not as strong an economy as it was. How does that shift things for Canadian commodities, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't, it's always hard to try and put an actual analysis onto that because you start talking what if scenarios. And what if they stop buying? Well, then everybody's going to be in trouble because again, you look at their demand numbers and without them, and obviously they can't just not buy anything
That's right. Yeah.
because then people start starving and then starving people in a country like that become very, very powerful. And so it's not like they would just exit the market completely. But what we are seeing again is these shifts. And, there are a few commodities, so canola being one of them, where they can't go buy canola in the amounts from anyone else that they can from Canada. Could they get some from Australia? Yes. But again, when you look at Australia having like a 6 million ton crop instead of 19 or 20, while their export capacity is just very limited. Same with the EU. Could they buy some from there? Yeah, probably. Ukraine, that sort of thing. But it's kind of like buying soybeans out of South America. Like it can be inconsistent, and the consistency is out of Canada.
Right.
Now again, if they do put tariffs on, then to me, I look at it and say, well, they weren't going to buy it anyways. And if the price drops far enough, they'll buy it because again, they recognize what a good price on the buying side is. So this really has been one to, for farmers to not let the emotional side get dragged into the decision making, not get caught up in these headlines and reading, everything that's going on Twitter and whatever else, and making decisions based on numbers and based on profitability. And that is going to get a lot tougher to do, given how a lot of areas look in Canada this year, because we're not, aside from canola, we're not a big enough driver on grain prices like the US would be or Russia, where if they have a crop disaster, it will drive the world markets. We'll have some impact, but not that much. And so
Yeah.
that's where, in a 2012 year where there was the massive drought in the US, we kind of got the best of both worlds because we didn't have the drought and we can tag along on the coattails on the pricing side.
Mm-hmm.
The really double whammy is when we have a crop issue and the US doesn't.
Yeah. which maybe is a little bit what's happening this year. We'll see.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit, not nearly to that extreme. I will note, because my friends here in Ontario would be very angry with me if I didn't say 2012 did hit Ontario. But Ontario, when we talk about crops, is a blip when we compare it to the US and Western Canada. So yes, you are all unique and beautiful butterflies and really matter, but corn, soybeans, wheat in Ontario is a blip when we compare it to the US and the West. But I'll just note 2012, apparently. I didn't live here at the time, but it was very, very dry here. It was the last real drought for here.
Well, and
So
that,
there you go.
I mean, again, when you look at how far Ontario extends south, that makes sense because until I lived there, I kind of just assumed that Ontario was straight east of me here.
Yes.
Which it is,
Yes.
part of it.
East of you is what Ontario calls north.
Yeah.
And I tried to explain that to them, but they don't understand. It's like I
Yeah.
have two heads. Anyway, okay. Brian Voth, IntelliFarm.ca. Thank you so much for joining me here on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
For the latest ag news, agronomic advice, and more, check out realagriculture.com and Real Ag Radio.